In the rolling hills of Kentucky, where the bluegrass swayed in the gentle breeze and thoroughbreds roamed in lush pastures, Victor Steele had built an empire on the back of a single horse. Thunderbolt, a majestic black stallion with a white blaze down his face, was more than just an animal to Victor. He was the key to fame, fortune, and a legacy that would echo through the annals of equestrian history. Victor, a man in his early 40s with salt-and-pepper hair and piercing blue eyes, had spent years honing his skills as a horse trainer. But it wasn't until Thunderbolt came into his life that he truly tasted success. The horse's natural athleticism, combined with Victor's rigorous training regimen, had turned them into an unstoppable force in the world of show jumping. Their partnership had begun 5 years ago when Victor spotted Thunderbolt at a small farm in Tennessee. The moment he laid eyes on the young colt, he knew he had found something special. With a mix of charm and cold hard cash, Victor convinced the farm owner to sell him the horse, promising to turn him into a champion. And a champion Thunderbolt became. Weekend after weekend, they traveled across the country, from the sun-soaked arenas of California to the prestigious events in New York. Thunderbolt's graceful leaps and Victor's expert guidance earned them trophy after trophy, sponsorship deals, and a growing fan base that hung on their every move. As their fame grew, so did Victor's ambition. He pushed Thunderbolt harder, demanding more height, more speed, more perfection. The bond between man and horse, once built on mutual respect and care, began to fray at the edges. Victor's eyes, once filled with pride when he looked at Thunderbolt, now held a calculating gleam, seeing the horse as a means to an end rather than a living, breathing creature. It was a warm Saturday afternoon in Lexington when everything changed. The Kentucky Horse Park was buzzing with excitement as the annual Grand Prix, one of the most prestigious events in the show jumping calendar, was about to begin. Victor and Thunderbolt were the favorites to win, and the stands were packed with spectators eager to see the dynamic duo in action. As they entered the arena, the crowd erupted in cheers. Thunderbolt's coat gleamed in the sunlight, his muscles rippling with each step. Victor, sitting tall in the saddle, gave a confident wave to the audience. They had done this 100 times before, and today would be no different. The bell rang, signaling the start of their round. Thunderbolt's hooves thundered against the ground as they set off, approaching the first jump with practiced ease. They cleared it effortlessly, moving on to the next with fluid grace. Jump after jump fell behind them as they wove through the course, the crowd holding their collective breath. But as they approached the final and most challenging obstacle, a towering oxer that would require all of Thunderbolt's strength and skill, something went wrong. Perhaps it was fatigue from the grueling training sessions Victor had put him through in the weeks leading up to the event. Maybe it was a slight miscalculation in their approach. Whatever the cause, as Thunderbolt launched himself into the air, it became clear that something was off. Time seemed to slow as horse and rider hung in the air. Victor, sensing the impending disaster, tensed in the saddle. Thunderbolt, straining to clear the jump, twisted his body in a desperate attempt to avoid the rails. The crowd gasped as they watched the magnificent animal crash into the obstacle, poles flying as he tumbled to the ground with a sickening thud. Victor was thrown clear, rolling across the arena floor before scrambling to his feet. But Thunderbolt lay motionless, his front leg bent at an unnatural angle. The arena fell silent, the only sound the labored breathing of the fallen horse. Veterinarians rushed to the scene as Victor stood back, his face a mask of shock and disbelief. The crowd watched in hushed silence as the vets examined Thunderbolt, their faces grim. After what seemed like an eternity, the head veterinarian approached Victor, shaking his head solemnly. "I'm sorry, Mr. Steele," he said, his voice low. "The injury is severe. Thunderbolt's show jumping days are over." The words hit Victor like a physical blow. In that moment, as he looked at Thunderbolt lying on the ground, he didn't see the loyal companion who had carried him to glory. He saw a broken investment, a shattered dream, a liability. As Thunderbolt was carefully loaded into a horse trailer, Victor's mind raced. The cost of rehabilitation, the lost income from future competitions, the potential stud fees, all of it slipped away like sand through his fingers. He made a decision then, one that would haunt him in the years to come. Under the cover of night, Victor drove the trailer containing the injured Thunderbolt to a remote field on the outskirts of Lexington. The moon cast long shadows as he opened the trailer door, coaxing the limping horse out onto the dew-covered grass. Thunderbolt looked at him with trusting eyes, unaware of the betrayal that was about to unfold. Victor removed Thunderbolt's halter, his hands shaking slightly. For a brief moment, as he looked into those big, dark eyes, he hesitated. But the cold, calculating part of his mind took over. With a pat on Thunderbolt's neck, the last act of affection he would show the horse, Victor turned and walked away. As he drove off, leaving Thunderbolt alone in the field, Victor told himself that nature would take its course. He convinced himself that this was a mercy, better than a life of pain and confinement. But deep down, he knew the truth. He was abandoning the very creature that had given him everything. Days passed, and Thunderbolt remained in the field, confused and in pain. The once proud show jumper struggled to move, his injured leg barely able to support his weight. He whinnied for help, for the humans he had trusted all his life, but no one came. The summer sun beat down mercilessly, and Thunderbolt's coat, once gleaming and well-groomed, became matted and dull. He grew thinner as he struggled to graze, the lush grass just out of reach. Each day was a battle for survival, each night a lonely vigil under the stars. As Thunderbolt fought for his life in that desolate field, fate was preparing to intervene in the form of a man named Charlie McAllister. Charlie, a widower in his late 50s, had moved to Lexington to escape the memories that haunted him in his hometown of Cincinnati. Charlie had lost his daughter, Sarah, to leukemia just a year ago. The pain of her absence was a constant ache in his heart, driving him to seek solace in the quiet countryside of Kentucky. He had bought a small farm on the outskirts of town, hoping that the peace and solitude would help heal his wounded soul. Little did Charlie know that his morning walk would lead him to a discovery that would change his life forever. As he crested a small hill, he saw a sight that made his heart skip a beat: a horse, clearly injured and malnourished, struggling to stand in the overgrown field. As Charlie approached, he recognized the animal. Even in his current state, there was no mistaking the distinctive blaze and the powerful build of Thunderbolt, the show-jumping sensation he had seen on TV countless times. Charlie's mind reeled, trying to understand how such a celebrated animal could have ended up in this condition. Pushing aside his questions, Charlie focused on the immediate need. He approached Thunderbolt slowly, speaking in soft, soothing tones. The horse, wary at first, seemed to sense Charlie's gentle nature and allowed him to come close. Charlie's heart broke as he saw the extent of Thunderbolt's injuries and neglect up close. Without a second thought, he knew what he had to do. With careful movements and reassuring words, he managed to guide Thunderbolt out of the field and back to his farm. That day marked the beginning of a new chapter for both Charlie and Thunderbolt. As Charlie tended to the horse's wounds and nursed him back to health, he found a new purpose, a reason to get up each morning. And Thunderbolt, betrayed and abandoned by the man he had trusted most, began to learn that not all humans would let him down. The road ahead would be long and challenging, but in that moment, as Charlie led Thunderbolt to safety, a spark of hope flickered to life in both their hearts. Little did they know that their journey together was just beginning, and that their paths crossing would set in motion a series of events that would touch the lives of many in the small Kentucky town they now called home. Charlie's modest farmhouse, nestled among rolling hills just outside Lexington, Kentucky, became an unlikely sanctuary for Thunderbolt. The spare bedroom, hastily converted into a makeshift stable, now housed the injured champion. Charlie had spent the better part of the day setting up a comfortable space, laying down fresh straw and ensuring the room was warm and dry. As dawn broke the next morning, Charlie found himself standing in the doorway, a steaming cup of coffee in hand, watching the rise and fall of Thunderbolt's chest. The horse's coat, once glossy and well-groomed, was matted and dull. His powerful muscles, honed through years of rigorous training and competition, had begun to waste away after days of neglect in the field. Charlie set his coffee down and approached Thunderbolt slowly, speaking in low, soothing tones. "Hey there, big guy. How are you feeling this morning?" The horse's ears twitched at the sound of Charlie's voice, and he lifted his head slightly, dark eyes regarding Charlie with a mix of wariness and curiosity. Over the next few weeks, a routine began to take shape. Charlie would wake at first light, heading straight to check on Thunderbolt before even brewing his morning coffee. He'd clean the makeshift stable, change Thunderbolt's water, and carefully apply medication to the horse's injured leg as prescribed by the local vet, Dr. Martinez. Dr. Martinez, a kind-faced woman in her early 40s, had been skeptical when Charlie first called her out to the farm. "Mr. McAllister," she'd said, her voice tinged with concern, "rehabilitating a horse with an injury this severe, it's going to be a long, difficult process. Are you sure you're up for this?" Charlie had looked at Thunderbolt, seeing not just a broken-down animal, but a kindred spirit, another being who had known loss and abandonment. "I'm sure," he'd replied, his voice firm with resolve. True to Dr. Martinez's words, the process was indeed challenging. There were days when the pain seemed too much for Thunderbolt, and he'd refuse to eat or drink. Charlie would sit with him for hours, talking softly, sharing stories about his life, his late wife Mary, and their daughter Sarah. "You know, Thunderbolt," Charlie said one particularly rough evening, his voice thick with emotion, "Sarah loved horses. She used to beg us to let her take riding lessons." He chuckled softly, remembering his daughter's enthusiasm. "If she could see me now, playing nurse to a champion show jumper, well, I think she'd get a real kick out of it." As the weeks turned into months, small victories began to accumulate. Thunderbolt's coat regained some of its former luster, thanks to Charlie's diligent grooming. His appetite improved, and he began to put on weight. Most importantly, he started to bear more weight on his injured leg. Dr. Martinez, during one of her regular checkups, couldn't hide her amazement. "I've got to hand it to you, Charlie," she said, shaking her head in disbelief. "When you first called me out here, I didn't think Thunderbolt had much of a chance. But look at him now. You've worked a miracle." Charlie shrugged off the praise, but couldn't help the small smile that tugged at his lips. "We've still got a long way to go," he said, patting Thunderbolt's neck gently. As Thunderbolt's physical health improved, so too did his trust in Charlie. The horse that had once shied away from human touch now leaned into Charlie's hand, seeking comfort and affection. For Charlie, these small gestures of trust were more rewarding than any words of praise from Dr. Martinez or the neighboring farmers who occasionally stopped by to check on their progress. One crisp autumn morning, Charlie decided it was time for Thunderbolt to venture outside. He'd prepared a small, fenced area near the house where Thunderbolt could safely move around without risking further injury. With slow, patient steps, he led the horse out of the makeshift stable and into the sunlight. Thunderbolt blinked in the bright light, his nostrils flaring as he took in the scents of grass and open air. For a moment, he stood stock-still, as if overwhelmed by the sensations. Then, with a soft nickering sound, he took a tentative step forward, then another. Charlie stood nearby, ready to offer support if needed, but Thunderbolt seemed to grow more confident with each step. As he watched Thunderbolt explore the enclosure, Charlie felt a lump form in his throat. It wasn't just Thunderbolt who was healing, he realized. The empty void left by Sarah's passing, which had seemed so all-consuming when he first moved to Kentucky, had begun to fill with purpose. The daily routine of caring for Thunderbolt, the small victories and setbacks, had given Charlie a reason to get up each morning, a focus beyond his grief. The days grew shorter and the air cooler as autumn deepened into winter. Charlie expanded Thunderbolt's exercise routine, leading him on short walks around the property. These walks became a form of therapy for both of them. Charlie found himself opening up, sharing thoughts and feelings he'd kept bottled up since Sarah's death. "You know, Thunderbolt," he said one frosty morning as they made their way along a well-worn path, "I used to think moving out here was about running away from memories. But now I'm starting to think it was about making room for new ones." Thunderbolt nickered softly in response, nudging Charlie's shoulder with his nose. Charlie chuckled, reaching up to scratch behind the horse's ears. "Yeah, I guess you're right. We're both getting a second chance here, aren't we?" As winter settled in, Charlie found himself facing new challenges. The old barn needed repairs to make it suitable for Thunderbolt, and the cost of feed and medical supplies was starting to strain his modest savings. But every time he considered giving up, he'd look into Thunderbolt's eyes and see the trust there, the unspoken bond that had formed between them. He knew he couldn't let the horse down. Charlie started picking up odd jobs around town to make ends meet. He'd help out at the local feed store on weekends, or lend a hand to neighboring farms during busy periods. The work was hard, but it felt good to be useful, to be part of a community again. The people of Lexington, true to their reputation for Southern hospitality, rallied around Charlie and Thunderbolt. Word had spread about the man who'd taken in the abandoned champion, and locals would often stop by with spare bales of hay or leftover feed. Mrs. Thompson, who ran the diner in town, made it a point to send home extra pie whenever Charlie stopped in for coffee. "You're doing a good thing, Charlie," she'd say, pressing the pie into his hands. "That horse is lucky to have found you." Charlie would smile and thank her, but in his heart, he knew the truth: he was the lucky one. Thunderbolt had given him a purpose, a reason to keep going when grief threatened to overwhelm him. As winter began to loosen its grip and the first hints of spring appeared, Charlie noticed a change in Thunderbolt. The horse seemed more energetic, eager for their daily walks. His gait, while still far from the graceful canter of his show-jumping days, had become steadier, more confident. One sunny afternoon in early March, as they returned from their walk, Thunderbolt surprised Charlie by breaking into a short trot. It only lasted a few seconds before the horse returned to his usual careful pace, but it was enough to bring tears to Charlie's eyes. That evening, as he sat on the porch watching the sun set, Charlie pulled out the old flip phone he kept for emergencies. With slightly trembling fingers, he dialed a number he knew by heart but hadn't called in months. "Hey, Lisa," he said when his sister picked up. "Yeah, it's me. I know it's been a while. I was wondering if you and the kids might want to come visit for a few days. There's someone here I'd like you to meet." As he hung up the phone, Charlie felt a sense of lightness he hadn't experienced in years. He looked over at Thunderbolt, grazing contentedly in the nearby field, and smiled. The road to healing was long and often difficult, but he no longer felt like he was walking it alone. Together, man and horse were finding their way back to life, one day at a time. Little did Charlie know that their journey was far from over. The bonds forged in hardship would soon be tested, as the shadows of the past threatened to overtake the fragile peace they had found. But for now, in the quiet of the Kentucky evening, hope bloomed as steadily as the first flowers of spring. As spring blossomed into summer, life on Charlie's farm settled into a comfortable rhythm. Thunderbolt's recovery, while slow, was steady. The once champion show jumper might never again soar over high fences, but he had regained much of his strength and vitality. Charlie's sister Lisa and her kids had come and gone, leaving behind memories of laughter and renewed family connections. On a warm June morning, Charlie was mucking out Thunderbolt's stable when he heard the crunch of tires on gravel. Visitors were rare out here, and Charlie felt a twinge of curiosity as he stepped out into the sunlight, shielding his eyes against the glare. A sleek black SUV had pulled up in front of the house, its polished surface out of place among the weathered farm buildings. As Charlie watched, the driver's door swung open, and a man stepped out. He was tall and well-built, with salt and pepper hair and designer sunglasses perched on his nose. Something about him seemed vaguely familiar to Charlie, though he couldn't quite place it. The man strode towards Charlie with the confidence of someone used to getting his way. As he got closer, he pulled off his sunglasses, revealing piercing blue eyes that swept over the farm with a calculating gaze. "You must be Charles McAllister," the man said, his voice smooth and cultured. He extended a hand. "I'm Victor Steele." The name hit Charlie like a punch to the gut. Victor Steele, the man who had abandoned Thunderbolt, leaving him to die in that lonely field. Charlie's hand clenched around the pitchfork he was holding, and he made no move to shake Victor's outstretched hand. "What are you doing here?" Charlie asked, his voice low and wary. Victor's smile didn't waver, but a flicker of annoyance crossed his face at the rebuff. "I've come to collect my property, Mr. McAllister. I believe you have something that belongs to me." Charlie's heart raced. He had known this day might come, had even prepared for it in the back of his mind, but facing Victor in the flesh was another matter entirely. "Thunderbolt isn't property," he said, fighting to keep his voice steady. "He's a living creature who was left to die. You gave up any claim to him the moment you abandoned him." Victor's smile turned cold. "I'm afraid the law doesn't quite see it that way, Mr. McAllister. Thunderbolt is a valuable asset, and I have the paperwork to prove he's mine. Now, where is he?" As if on cue, a soft whinny came from the nearby paddock. Both men turned to see Thunderbolt trotting towards the fence, his coat gleaming in the sunlight. The horse's eyes were fixed on Charlie, ignoring Victor entirely. Victor's eyes widened slightly, a mix of surprise and greed flickering across his face. Well, he murmured. You've done quite a job with him, haven't you? All the more reason he should come back where he belongs. Charlie stepped between Victor and the paddock, his jaw set. He is where he belongs, he said firmly. Thunderbolt's home is here now. Victor's facade of politeness dropped away, his voice turning hard. Listen here, old man. That horse is worth a fortune, even if he can't jump anymore. Do you have any idea what his stud fees alone could bring in? I'm not about to let some washed-up nobody stand in the way of what's rightfully mine. The insult stung, but Charlie stood his ground. I may be a nobody to you, Mr. Steele, but I'm somebody to Thunderbolt. And I'm not letting you anywhere near him. Victor's eyes narrowed dangerously. You're making a big mistake, McAllister. I've got lawyers who will bury you in paperwork. You'll lose this farm trying to fight me. For a moment, fear gripped Charlie's heart. He wasn't a wealthy man, and the cost of caring for Thunderbolt had already strained his resources. But then he heard another soft whinny behind him, felt the trust and love that had grown between him and Thunderbolt over the past months, and his resolve hardened. Do what you have to do, Charlie said, meeting Victor's gaze steadily. But Thunderbolt stays here. Victor stared at him for a long moment, then shook his head with a humorless laugh. You're going to regret this, McAllister. I'll be back, and next time, I'll be bringing the sheriff with me. With that, Victor turned on his heel and stalked back to his SUV. The engine roared to life, and he peeled out of the driveway in a cloud of dust, leaving Charlie standing alone in the yard, his heart pounding. As the dust settled, Charlie walked over to the paddock fence. Thunderbolt nickered softly, reaching out to nuzzle Charlie's hand. It's okay, boy, Charlie murmured, stroking the horse's nose. We'll figure this out somehow. But even as he spoke the reassuring words, worry gnawed at Charlie's gut. He knew Victor Steele wasn't a man to make idle threats. The battle for Thunderbolt's future had only just begun, and Charlie wasn't sure he had the resources to fight it. That evening, as Charlie sat on his porch watching the sun set, he pondered his options. He could try to scrape together enough money for a lawyer, but he knew it would be a drop in the bucket compared to the legal firepower Victor could bring to bear. He could reach out to animal rights organizations, but would they be interested in helping one horse when there were so many others in need? As darkness fell, Charlie made a decision. He couldn't fight this battle alone. He needed help, and he knew just where to start looking. The next morning, Charlie drove into Lexington, heading for the local diner where he occasionally picked up breakfast. As he pushed open the door, the bell jingling overhead, he scanned the room until he spotted a familiar face. Rachel Turner sat in a booth near the back, a cup of coffee in front of her and a laptop open on the table. She looked up as Charlie approached, a smile lighting up her face. Charlie. Good to see you, she said warmly. Then, noting the worry lines creasing his forehead, her smile faded. What's wrong? Charlie slid into the booth across from her with a heavy sigh. Rachel, I need your help. It's about Thunderbolt. Rachel's eyebrows shot up. Before moving to Lexington to start her own small horse therapy program, she had worked for Victor Steele as a trainer. She knew Thunderbolt and Victor all too well. Over the next hour, as Rachel's coffee grew cold and forgotten, Charlie filled her in on everything that had happened. Victor's abandonment of Thunderbolt, Charlie finding the injured horse, the months of rehabilitation, and now, Victor's sudden reappearance and threats. When Charlie finished, Rachel sat back, her face a mix of anger and determination. That bastard, she muttered. I always knew Victor was cold, but this is a new low, even for him. I don't know what to do, Rachel, Charlie admitted. I can't afford a long legal battle, but I can't just give Thunderbolt up either. Not after everything we've been through. Rachel was quiet for a moment, her fingers tapping thoughtfully on the table. Then she looked up, a spark of an idea in her eyes. You know, Charlie, Victor's not the only one with resources. I've still got connections in the equestrian world. People who knew Thunderbolt, who might be willing to help. Hope flickered in Charlie's chest. You think they'd stand up to Victor? Rachel nodded slowly. Some of them have been looking for a reason to take Victor down a peg for years. And I've got something else that might help: documentation. Charlie leaned forward, intrigued. What kind of documentation? Records, Rachel said, her voice low. Of Victor's treatment of his horses. The drugs he used to push them past their limits, the injuries he covered up. I kept copies of everything before I left. I always thought I might need them someday. Charlie's eyes widened. Rachel, that could change everything. She reached across the table, squeezing his hand. We're not going to let Victor win this one, Charlie. Thunderbolt deserves better, and so do you. As they left the diner, plans already forming, Charlie felt a weight lift from his shoulders. The road ahead would be difficult, but he was no longer facing it alone. With Rachel by his side and the truth as their weapon, they stood a fighting chance against Victor Steele. Little did they know, their actions were about to set in motion a chain of events that would shake the equestrian world to its core. The battle for Thunderbolt's future was about to become much bigger than just one horse and one man. It was about to become a fight for justice, for the rights of animals, and for the soul of a sport that had lost its way. As Charlie drove home, the Kentucky countryside rolling past his window, he felt a renewed sense of purpose. Whatever came next, he was ready to face it. For Thunderbolt, for himself, and for all the other animals who couldn't speak for themselves, he would stand his ground. The sun was setting as Charlie pulled into his driveway, painting the sky in brilliant shades of orange and pink. In the paddock, Thunderbolt lifted his head, nickering a greeting. Charlie smiled, feeling a surge of affection for the horse who had changed his life in so many ways. We're going to be okay, boy, he said softly, reaching out to stroke Thunderbolt's nose. We've got friends on our side now. And we're going to fight this, together. As the first stars began to twinkle in the darkening sky, Charlie headed inside to make some phone calls. The battle was just beginning, but for the first time since Victor's visit, he felt a glimmer of hope. Whatever challenges lay ahead, he was ready to face them head-on. The Lexington Horse Park buzzed with activity as the annual Kentucky Summer Horse Show got underway. Trailers and RVs filled the parking lots, horses nickered in their temporary stalls, and the air was thick with excitement and the scent of hay and leather. For Charlie McAllister, however, the atmosphere was charged with tension. It had been 2 months since Victor Steele's threatening visit to the farm. 2 months of preparation, of late nights poring over documents with Rachel, of reaching out to contacts in the equestrian world. Now, it all came down to this, a public confrontation that would determine Thunderbolt's fate. Charlie stood at the edge of the main arena, his hands gripping the white fence so tightly his knuckles turned white. Rachel stood beside him, her face set in determination. They had chosen this venue carefully, a place where Victor couldn't hide behind lawyers or closed doors, where the equestrian community could bear witness to the truth. Are you ready for this? Rachel asked, her voice low. Charlie took a deep breath, steadying himself. As ready as I'll ever be, he replied. Just then, a ripple of whispers spread through the crowd. Charlie looked up to see Victor Steele striding towards the arena, flanked by 2 men in expensive suits, likely his lawyers. Victor's face was a mask of confident disdain, clearly expecting to wrap this up quickly and decisively. As Victor approached, Charlie stepped forward to meet him. The 2 men faced each other in the center of the arena, the gathered crowd falling silent in anticipation. Mr. McAllister, Victor said, his voice dripping with false politeness. I had hoped we could resolve this matter privately, but since you insist on making a spectacle. Charlie cut him off. This isn't about putting on a show, Mr. Steele. This is about doing what's right for Thunderbolt and for all the other horses you've mistreated over the years. Victor's eyes narrowed dangerously. Careful, old man. You're treading on thin ice. Before Charlie could respond, Rachel stepped forward, a thick folder in her hands. Actually, Victor, I think you're the one on thin ice, she said, her voice carrying across the now silent arena. Victor's head snapped around, his eyes widening in recognition. Rachel? What are you doing here? Rachel smiled grimly, setting the record straight. She turned to address the crowd. Ladies and gentlemen, my name is Rachel Turner. I worked for Victor Steele for 5 years as a trainer. During that time, I witnessed and documented numerous instances of animal abuse, doping, and willful neglect. A murmur ran through the crowd. Victor's face darkened. "You're lying," he snarled. "You have no proof." "Oh, but I do," Rachel replied calmly. She opened the folder, pulling out a stack of papers. Training logs detailing the use of illegal performance enhancers. Veterinary reports of injuries that were covered up. And financial records showing the sale and disposal of horses that were no longer profitable. As Rachel began to read from the documents, the crowd's murmur grew louder. Charlie saw shock and anger on many faces. Victor's lawyers huddled together, whispering urgently. Victor himself seemed to shrink under the weight of the revelations. His confident facade crumbled, replaced by a mixture of rage and panic. "This is slander," he shouted. "I'll sue you for every penny you have." Charlie stepped forward again. "It's not slander if it's true, Mr. Steele. And we're not the only ones who know the truth." On cue, several people stepped out of the crowd. Charlie recognized them from the photos Rachel had shown him, former employees of Victor's, other trainers, even a few well-known riders. One by one, they began to share their own stories of Victor's cruelty and callousness. As the testimonies continued, Charlie noticed movement at the edge of the arena. He turned to see Dr. Martinez leading Thunderbolt towards them. The horse moved with a slight limp, a permanent reminder of his injury, but his coat gleamed in the sunlight and his eyes were bright and alert. A hush fell over the crowd as Thunderbolt entered the arena. The horse's gaze swept over the gathered people before settling on Charlie. With a soft nicker, Thunderbolt trotted over to him, nuzzling his shoulder affectionately. Charlie stroked Thunderbolt's neck, drawing strength from the horse's presence. He looked up at Victor, who was staring at Thunderbolt with a mixture of longing and frustration. "This is what it's all about, Mr. Steele," Charlie said, his voice carrying clearly across the arena. "Not trophies or money or reputation. It's about the bond between a human and a horse. It's about trust and care and doing what's right." He paused, looking around at the crowd. Thunderbolt was a champion because of his heart, not because of any drugs or harsh training methods. And when he was injured, when he needed help the most, Mr. Steele abandoned him to die in a field. Victor opened his mouth to protest, but Charlie pressed on. "I found Thunderbolt broken and starving. I nursed him back to health. I gave him a home and a purpose beyond jumping fences. And I'm standing here today to make sure he never has to suffer at the hands of someone who sees him as nothing more than a meal ticket again." The silence that followed was deafening. Charlie could feel the weight of hundreds of eyes on him, on Thunderbolt, on Victor. For a long moment, no one moved or spoke. Then, from somewhere in the back of the crowd, someone began to applaud. The sound spread quickly, growing into a thunderous ovation that echoed across the arena. Charlie saw nods of approval, heard shouts of encouragement. He even noticed a few people wiping tears from their eyes. Victor Steele stood alone in the center of the arena, the united front of his lawyers having melted away in the face of overwhelming evidence and public opinion. His shoulders slumped, the fight gone out of him. One of the event organizers, a stern-faced woman in her 60s, stepped forward. "Mr. Steele," she said, her voice crisp and authoritative, "in light of these revelations, the Kentucky Horse Show Committee has no choice but to ban you from all future events. We will also be recommending a full investigation by the relevant authorities." Victor's face drained of color. Without a word, he turned and walked out of the arena, leaving behind the wreckage of his reputation and career. As the crowd began to disperse, people came up to Charlie and Rachel, offering congratulations and support. Dr. Martinez approached, a wide smile on her face. "You did it, Charlie," she said warmly. "You stood up for what was right, and you won." Charlie shook his head, his hand still resting on Thunderbolt's neck. "We won," he corrected her. "All of us. And most of all, Thunderbolt won." As the sun began to set over the horse park, casting long shadows across the arena, Charlie led Thunderbolt back to his trailer. The day's events had been exhausting, but exhilarating. He knew there would be more challenges ahead, legal battles to officially secure Thunderbolt's ownership, decisions to be made about the horse's future. But for now, he was content. Rachel joined him as he was preparing to leave. "So," she said, a hint of mischief in her voice, "what's next for Charlie McAllister and his famous rescue horse?" Charlie chuckled, patting Thunderbolt's flank. "Oh, I reckon we'll head home, have a good night's sleep, and see what tomorrow brings. One day at a time, right boy?" Thunderbolt nickered softly in response. As they drove away from the horse park, the Kentucky countryside bathed in the warm glow of sunset, Charlie felt a profound sense of peace. The road ahead was uncertain, but he was no longer walking it alone. With Thunderbolt by his side and a community of supporters behind him, he was ready to face whatever came next. The battle had been won, but the journey was far from over. In fact, as Charlie would soon discover, it was only just beginning. The weeks following the confrontation at the Kentucky Horse Show were a whirlwind for Charlie McAllister. News of Victor Steele's downfall spread quickly through the equestrian world and beyond, catapulting Charlie and Thunderbolt into an unexpected spotlight. Reporters called daily, seeking interviews and updates. Animal rights activists reached out, praising Charlie's stand against abuse. Even a few Hollywood producers contacted him, floating ideas about movie rights to Thunderbolt's story. Through it all, Charlie remained grounded, his focus never straying far from Thunderbolt's well-being. The legal battle to secure official ownership of the horse was mercifully short. Victor, his reputation in tatters, signed over all rights to Thunderbolt without a fight. For the first time since he'd found the injured horse in that lonely field, Charlie could truly relax, knowing that Thunderbolt's future was secure. But as the dust began to settle, a new question arose. What now? Charlie had poured his heart and soul into Thunderbolt's rehabilitation, and the fight to keep him safe had consumed his life for months. With that chapter closed, he found himself at a crossroads. It was Rachel who first planted the seed of an idea. She had stopped by the farm one crisp fall afternoon, as she often did these days. Charlie was brushing Thunderbolt in the paddock when she leaned on the fence, a thoughtful expression on her face. "You know, Charlie," she said, "I've been thinking. What you did for Thunderbolt, it's something a lot of other horses need too." Charlie paused in his brushing, looking over at her curiously. "What do you mean?" Rachel's eyes lit up with excitement. "I mean, what if we could create a place for other horses like Thunderbolt? Ones that have been abandoned or abused, that need a second chance." The idea took root in Charlie's mind, growing stronger with each passing day. He thought about it as he went about his daily chores, as he took Thunderbolt on their now customary evening walks. He thought about all the other horses out there who might be suffering as Thunderbolt had, with no one to rescue them. One evening, as the sun was setting over the Kentucky hills, painting the sky in brilliant shades of orange and pink, Charlie made his decision. He was sitting on the porch, Thunderbolt grazing contentedly nearby, when he pulled out his phone and dialed Rachel's number. "Rachel," he said when she answered. "I think you're right. We need to do this. For all the other Thunderbolts out there." Rachel's enthusiasm was palpable even through the phone. "I was hoping you'd say that. I've already started putting together some ideas. We could call it Thunderbolt's Haven, what do you think?" Charlie smiled, watching as Thunderbolt lifted his head, ears pricked forward as if he knew they were talking about him. "I think it's perfect," he said softly. The next few months were a flurry of activity. Charlie and Rachel threw themselves into planning, researching everything from zoning laws to non-profit regulations. They reached out to their contacts in the equestrian world, sharing their vision and seeking support. To their surprise and delight, help came pouring in from all directions. Local farmers offered to donate hay and feed. Veterinarians volunteered their services. Even a few of Victor's former employees, eager to make amends for their past silence, stepped forward with offers of assistance. Perhaps the most unexpected support came from Lisa, Charlie's sister. She arrived one weekend with her kids in tow, armed with a thick folder of grant applications and fundraising ideas. "You didn't think I was going to let you do this alone, did you?" she said, giving Charlie a warm hug. "Sarah would have loved this. I want to help make it happen." As winter melted into spring, Thunderbolt's Haven began to take shape. Charlie's modest farm transformed, with new stables rising alongside the old barn, paddocks expanded, and a small office built to handle the administrative side of things. The first new arrival came in late March, a skinny, nervous mare named Daisy, rescued from a neglectful owner. Charlie would never forget the moment he led her into her new stall, Thunderbolt watching curiously from the adjacent paddock. As Daisy settled in, nickering softly as she explored her new home, Charlie felt a surge of emotion. This was why they were doing this. More horses followed, some old and arthritic, others young and full of potential, all in need of care and compassion. Each one brought new challenges and joys. Charlie found himself busier than he'd ever been, but also more fulfilled. Thunderbolt, to Charlie's amusement, seemed to take on the role of welcoming committee. The once skittish horse now approached each newcomer with gentle curiosity, often being the first to make them feel at home. As word of Thunderbolt's haven spread, visitors began to arrive. School groups came to learn about horse care and animal welfare. Families looking to adopt rescued horses toured the facilities. Even a few celebrities, drawn by the heartwarming story, stopped by to offer their support and raise awareness for the cause. One warm Saturday in June, Charlie stood at the entrance to the main barn, watching as Rachel led a group of eager volunteers through an orientation session. The sound of horses nickering and the chatter of excited voices filled the air. He felt a presence beside him and turned to see Lisa, a proud smile on her face. "You've done something amazing here, Charlie," she said softly. Charlie shook his head. "We've done something amazing," he corrected her. "I couldn't have done this alone." Just then, he heard a familiar whinny. Thunderbolt trotted up to the fence of his paddock, his coat gleaming in the sunlight. Charlie walked over, reaching out to stroke the horse's nose. "What do you think, old friend?" he murmured. "Did we do okay?" Thunderbolt nickered softly, leaning into Charlie's touch. In that moment, surrounded by the sounds and sights of the sanctuary they'd created, Charlie felt a profound sense of rightness. This was where he was meant to be, doing what he was meant to do. As the day wore on, Charlie found himself constantly in motion, answering questions, solving problems, making sure everything ran smoothly. It was tiring work, but deeply satisfying. Each smile from a volunteer, each contented sigh from a rescued horse, reminded him of why they'd started this journey. That evening, as the sun began to set, Charlie took a rare moment for himself. He climbed the small hill behind the main barn, Thunderbolt following close behind. From the top, he could see the entire sanctuary spread out before him, the barns, the paddocks, the fields where rescued horses grazed peacefully. Charlie sat down in the grass, and Thunderbolt lowered himself to the ground beside him, a companionable presence. As the sky turned golden, then pink, then deep purple, Charlie reflected on the journey that had brought them here. From that first moment in the abandoned field to this hilltop overlooking a sanctuary that bore Thunderbolt's name, it had been a path filled with challenges and triumphs, setbacks and unexpected joys. They had faced down threats and overcome obstacles, always moving forward, always guided by the bond between a man and a horse that had started it all. As the first stars began to twinkle in the darkening sky, Charlie put his hand on Thunderbolt's neck, feeling the steady rhythm of the horse's breathing. "We did it, boy," he said softly. "We really did it." Thunderbolt nickered softly in response, and Charlie smiled. The road ahead would undoubtedly bring new challenges, new horses to save, new battles to fight. But here, in this moment, with Thunderbolt by his side and the sanctuary spread out before him, Charlie McAllister knew one thing for certain: whatever came next, they would face it together. As night fell over Thunderbolt's haven, bringing with it a peaceful quiet broken only by the occasional soft whinny or rustle of hay, Charlie felt a deep sense of contentment. This new beginning wasn't just for him, or for Thunderbolt, or even for the other rescued horses. It was a new beginning for all of them, a chance to heal, to grow, and to create something truly meaningful. Tomorrow would bring new adventures, new horses to rescue, new lives to change. But for now, Charlie was content to sit in the starlight with his faithful friend, grateful for the journey that had brought them here, and excited for all that was yet to come. The years rolled by like the gentle hills of Kentucky, each one bringing new challenges and triumphs to Thunderbolt's haven. What had started as a dream born from one man's connection with a rescued horse had blossomed into a beacon of hope for equines and humans alike. As Thunderbolt entered his twilight years, his coat graying around the muzzle, he remained the heart and soul of the sanctuary. Though he no longer galloped across the fields with the same vigor of his youth, his presence continued to inspire all who visited. Children would gather around his paddock, listening wide-eyed as Charlie recounted the story of how a broken-down show jumper had changed his life and sparked a movement. Charlie, now in his late 60s with lines of laughter etched around his eyes, marveled at how far they'd come. The sanctuary had expanded beyond his wildest dreams, now spanning over 200 acres with facilities to care for dozens of rescued horses at a time. But more than just a safe haven for animals, Thunderbolt's Haven had become a center for education and healing. On a crisp autumn morning, Charlie stood at the edge of the main pasture, watching as a group of teenagers led horses through a series of gentle exercises. These were kids from a local youth rehabilitation program, finding purpose and building confidence through their work with the rescued horses. Charlie smiled, remembering how this particular program had started. It had been Rachel's idea, inspired by her own work in equine therapy. "These horses have so much to teach us about resilience," she had said. "Why not use that to help kids who are struggling?" The program had been an immediate success, with social workers and juvenile court judges from across the state referring young people to Thunderbolt's Haven. Charlie had lost count of the number of times he'd seen a surly, defensive teenager transform over the course of a few weeks, their walls coming down as they bonded with a horse that had known its own share of hardship. As he watched, one of the teens, a girl with vibrant blue hair who had arrived at the sanctuary a month ago with a chip on her shoulder the size of Kentucky, leaned in to whisper something to the old mare she was leading. The horse nickered softly in response, and the girl's face lit up with a smile that made her look her age for the first time since she'd arrived. Charlie felt a presence beside him and turned to see Rachel, her once auburn hair now streaked with silver. She followed his gaze to the girl and her horse, a knowing smile on her face. "Another miracle in the making?" she asked softly. Charlie nodded. "Seems like it happens every day around here." It wasn't just troubled youth who found healing at Thunderbolt's Haven. Veterans struggling with PTSD worked with steady, patient horses to find calm and purpose. Children with disabilities discovered newfound confidence astride gentle ponies specially trained for therapeutic riding. Even corporate groups came for team-building retreats, learning lessons in communication and trust from the herd dynamics of the rescued horses. The sanctuary had also become a hub for research and education. Universities partnered with Thunderbolt's Haven to study equine behavior and the effects of animal-assisted therapy. Veterinary students came to gain hands-on experience with a diverse population of horses, each with unique needs and histories. And every summer, the sanctuary hosted camps for kids interested in animal welfare and conservation. As Charlie and Rachel walked back towards the main barn, they passed the memorial garden, a peaceful corner of the sanctuary dedicated to the horses who had passed on. At its center stood a beautiful bronze statue of Thunderbolt in his prime, captured mid-leap as if soaring over an invisible fence. Around the base, plaques bore the names of horses who had spent their final days at the sanctuary, each one remembered and honored. Charlie paused at the statue, reaching out to touch its sun-warmed surface. "You know," he said reflectively, "when I found Thunderbolt in that field all those years ago, I thought I was saving him. But really, he was saving me." Rachel squeezed his shoulder gently. "He saved a lot of us, Charlie. And he's still saving others, through everything you've built here." As if summoned by their conversation, a soft whinny caught their attention. They turned to see Thunderbolt himself ambling towards them, his gait a bit stiff with age but his eyes still bright and alert. Charlie met him halfway, stroking the horse's nose affectionately. "Hey there, old friend," he murmured. "Ears still burning after all these years?" Thunderbolt nickered softly, leaning into Charlie's touch. For a moment, Charlie was transported back to that first encounter in the abandoned field, feeling once again the instant connection that had changed the course of both their lives. The sound of laughter drew Charlie back to the present. A group of elementary school students on a field trip was making its way towards the education center, chattering excitedly about the horses they'd seen. Their teacher, a young woman with a familiar face, waved as she passed. "Hi, Mr. McAllister." "Hi, Ms. Turner," she called out cheerfully. Charlie waved back, smiling as he recognized her. "Is that little Amy Thompson? When did she grow up and become a teacher?" Rachel chuckled. "Time flies, Charlie. She was one of our first junior volunteers, remember? Used to spend every weekend here mucking out stalls and helping with the horses. Charlie shook his head in wonder. And now she's bringing her own students here. I guess that's how legacies work, huh? As the day wore on, Charlie found himself reflecting on the idea of legacy. It wasn't just about the physical sanctuary, impressive as it was. It was about the lives touched, the ripples of compassion and understanding that spread out into the world with each person who passed through Thunderbolt's Haven. He thought about Victor Steele, whose cruelty had inadvertently set this whole journey in motion. Last Charlie had heard, Victor was working at a small stable in Florida, his days of fame and fortune long behind him. But even that, Charlie mused, was a kind of legacy, a cautionary tale about the consequences of putting profit above compassion. As evening approached, Charlie made his usual rounds, checking on each of the sanctuary's residents. He paused at each stall, offering a kind word or a gentle pat. Many of these horses had come to them broken in body and spirit, much like Thunderbolt had been. Seeing them now, healthy, trusting, at peace, filled Charlie with a profound sense of gratitude. The last stop on his rounds was always Thunderbolt's stall. The old horse greeted him with a soft nicker, his eyes bright despite the grey that now peppered his muzzle. Charlie leaned against the stall door, taking in the sight of his old friend. "What do you think, Thunderbolt?" he asked softly. "Did we do okay?" As if in answer, Thunderbolt stepped forward, resting his head on Charlie's shoulder in a gesture of affection he'd done countless times over the years. Charlie wrapped his arms around the horse's neck, feeling the steady rhythm of his breathing. In that moment, surrounded by the gentle sounds of the sanctuary at dusk, Charlie felt a deep sense of peace. The road hadn't always been easy, but every challenge, every setback, every small victory had led them here. To this place of healing, of hope, of second chances. As the first stars began to twinkle in the darkening sky, Charlie gave Thunderbolt one last pat and stepped out of the stall. He walked slowly back to the small house he'd built on the sanctuary grounds, his mind full of memories and his heart full of gratitude. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new horses to save, new lives to change. But tonight, Charlie McAllister slept soundly, knowing that the legacy he and Thunderbolt had built together would continue to offer hope and healing for years to come. In the pastures of Thunderbolt's Haven, under a sky full of stars, rescued horses grazed peacefully, their troubled pasts behind them. And in a special stall near the heart of the sanctuary, an old champion rested easy, his legacy of hope living on in every life touched by the haven that bore his name. The story of Charlie and Thunderbolt, of a man and a horse who found each other when they needed it most, had become more than just a tale of rescue and redemption. It had become a beacon, a reminder that even in the darkest times, compassion and determination could light the way to a brighter future. And as long as Thunderbolt's Haven stood, that light would continue to shine, offering hope to all who needed it, human and horse alike.